Redacted, an action roguelike top-down shooter with some melee potential. This is a Hades-like, is really what it comes down to. And, you know, there's a lot of games that want to be a Hades-like, understandably so, because, you know, well, Hades did quite well, and people want to try to recreate the thrill of Hades. The only thing about Hades that's a bit more complicated than other genres is that, well, Hades has a lot of content, and one of the great things about Hades is that there's a lot to do. I think that really is one of the core identities. It's not very easy to find many Hades-likes out there, because you just need a team of people that can make sure they have enough things to play with throughout all your playtime. And Redacted definitely has a lot going for it. It's interesting, because Redacted to me is a game that has a lot of ups and quite a few downs personally, so we're going to talk about all of that. But first, let's go through my usual list. First, I want to talk about the audio visuals, the charm of the game, the vibe. And this game has an awesome vibe for sure. The VFX and specifically the cinematics and stuff have kind of like a comic book vibe going for it. Even in some visual effects, like the hammer, when I swing it, you can see the little smoky effects at the end have all those little dots. It is something that you would find in comic books, and so it's really trying to go for that kind of little style without it being hand drawn. In terms of the vibe, this game is definitely going for something that is not very serious. It's full of humor. And it's full of just like, yeah, you can get out there and live if you don't suck, kind of vibe, which I'll say personally is kind of a hit and miss. There's a lot of characters in this game that you're going to be facing and that you're going to be interacting with, and they're going to be constantly talking in your ears. As you progress, you're going to be having people just saying, like the nerdy guy is like, ha, I cast fireball on you. Oh no, critical miss. Oh, you'll get like the therapist who's like, I think you need a day off, and like that kind of humor, that kind of vibe, which is funny in the context that this is a zombie apocalypse world, and these people are just trying to just get out of here, but they also are not afraid to, you know, kill you in the process. And the overall narrator is constantly following you around and saying what's going on with a bit of humor. I think the voice acting is pretty great. But in terms of the writing, it might not be for everybody. I think it fits every now and then. Visuals, I think, are pretty decent. The VFX are great, personally. I think shooting and big hammer attacks and the big laser gun, all these, they look great while also staying in its own little art styles. Now, audio. The audio is actually interesting. This is not something I usually say very often, but the music is kind of hit and miss for me. I mean, it's kind of going for like rock and roll, like fun, like hectic kind of thing. Nothing too epic or serious once again. But for some reason, the second world and the third world, for me, have this loop, this obnoxious loop. And I think they've got to go for it. Like, I'm pretty sure that was the point, if for it to be obnoxious, because it's like a 2-second loop, and it just keeps on going. It keeps on going, and same from the second world and like both worlds. It gets so in your ear. It's just so loud, and it's weird. It can get a little much sometimes, I would say, which is kind of interesting. If you've played the game, you'll definitely know what I'm talking about. Other than that, yeah, the sound effects are pretty great. When you take damage, there's this big saturated like electric guitar sound that's kind of like doing like some weird like notes as you have a little sound of the character taking damage. The thing is, this game, you really don't have many iframes, which means that when you take damage continuously, you'll get that guitar sound like just screeching in your ears constantly again. It's interesting. Like, clearly this was intended. And I don't know how to describe it. It's just that sometimes you're like, I get it. Stop screeching in my ears. I'm sorry I took damage. Other than that, music's good. Sound design is good. Visuals are good. I do like the vibe they're going for. I mean, even when you look at like backgrounds visually, you really see the differences between all the biomes. I think they did a good job of that. Let's talk core gameplay. I think the core gameplay is quite interesting. Basically, with the core gameplay, you've got a lot of things you can do. You can attack. You can see here like all the different attack options here on the side. Similar to to Hades, you got a few different button combinations you could do. In this game, there's quite a few. You can dash, you can dash kick, you can just kick naturally, you can attack with your hammer, but you can also charge up the hammer attack. You can shoot with your gun, obviously. You also have an additional ability, which is your GRP, which is just kind of like a little burst of energy that just throws enemies and barrels around. And you can also have your dash attack when you're dashing and attacking at the same time. So there's a lot of different things you can do from the get-go, which is great. I think it's cool that you have a lot of things to do from the start. You don't need to just always get a bunch of boons in order for things to be interesting, all things considered. Now, I think that overall, when you get into a run and you fight the hordes of enemies and everything, it's cool that you have a lot of different options. I think that even though there's a lot of things you can do, there's a lot of different options. I mean, this might just be me, but I've also made sure to look around and just see what other people say, just briefly. And it seems like the melee is a little clunky overall. It's hard to explain without playing it, but once you've played this game a little bit, it's quite noticeable how the gun to melee and melee to gun don't transition super fluidly. And I'm not 100% sure exactly why. There might be some input buffering issues, or just naturally the animations just take a long time. Like, you can't really cancel out of like an animation and do your next attack very easily. So generally combos are not super fluid and super fast pace, not like Hades in that regard. And I would say that in general, melee weapons are just a little underwhelming. That's also due to how some of the enemy design is in general. Getting in melee range just generally doesn't really feel worth it most of the time. So unfortunately to me, and again, this might just mostly be me, but in my experience, it feels like if you're going for a melee build, then it's going to be much harder and much less consistent than doing a range build, which is a bit disappointing because it really does feel like it's one or the other. It's kind of hard to utilize both equally, which is a shame because there's as much effort put into both angles, I would say. There's equal amount of melee weapons to choose from as there are from ranged weapons. So I find it a little disappointing personally that this game feels like it's just mostly a shooter with a slight melee thing on the back. Even though the game is trying to make sure that it is equal, it does not feel equal. I mean, the charge attacks on the melee weapons, I think, feel terrible, unfortunately. And I think that's also because you can't charge up your melee weapon until you're done with your full animation or whatever you're doing before. And it takes forever to charge that ability, and most of the time it's just not really worth spending that much time charging up something when you can just use your range attack to just destroy whatever you're trying to destroy. That being said, there's still some cool things you can do with melee. I mean, melee deals a lot more damage. So overall, if you're looking for DPS, then melee is usually going to be the right choice. But again, with the enemy design, that's not always going to be an option when some enemies just attack instantly, and this game is very hard, which we'll be discussing in just a moment. Overall, it is enjoyable, and with the VFX and the sound effects, it feels great killing enemies, but it can also feel a little frustrating every now and then to feel like things just don't chain together very well. So now I'm going to talk about a few unique aspects of this game, including some of the roguelike elements. If you're going to try to do like a Hades-like, being just a full-on clone of Hades might not be, the best thing. You want to have your own identity. So what are some of the things that this game does that is pretty unique? One of the things that it does is the whole rival system. The rival system is very interesting. Especially since you're not aware that the rival system is going to be a thing until you've put in like over 2 hours, maybe. And then like after like 5 hours, you finally get the full-on system available to you. Now I say available, it's kind of like thrown to you and you don't have a choice. You kind of have to actually deal with it, whether you like it or not. Basically, when you start playing a run, you're immediately going to have rivals that are also trying to end the run. They're just doing their own thing on their side, but they're also trying to get to the end and take the escape pod. Basically, there's only one escape pod. We're all trying to get to it before anybody else. So there's few things that this creates. First of all, this means that this game is constantly pushing players to play fast. If you don't play fast, even after clearing a room, even though there's no more threats, you need to go fast to the next room, because it doesn't pause between anything. There's not a single moment those rivals are not just going to be progressing. So you're constantly having to look at the next room and looking at the rewards, going in it, killing things fast. The only time that they're not progressing is obviously when you're like choosing your boon when the window is popping up. But other than that, every single other moment, those rivals are just trying to get to the end before you, which is kind of crazy. Now, luckily for me, I speedrun Hades quite a bit, so it genuinely reminded me of that, where after clearing a room, I wanted to pause so I could just look at the room rewards and then take it all in and then just like think about what the best room was for me to pick. But this is a core mechanic, which is crazy, especially since the game is really hard. I could imagine a lot of people being pretty discouraged about that. Now, I myself actually don't know what happens if you get to the end, beat the final boss, but someone already took an escape pod. I don't know what happens because I've only actually beaten the boss only once, which I'll talk about in a moment. And also, after a while, the NPCs are pretty easy to deal with, in my opinion. The rivals, there's just a pretty easy system to just not have to worry about them. It's just kind of interesting that it's part of the mechanic. What do I think of it? I think the mechanic is kind of whatever. One of the problems I have with it is that I actually think that the NPC fights, when you actually encounter the rivals, I think those fights are not great, because fighting the NPCs just, it feels kind of weird, because you can't really get into melee range because they will do attacks instantly, but you can very easily kite them around and just kill them from a distance with your gun, chipping away at their health very easily, and you can consistently kill all the rivals very easily if you do that. If you want a challenge, you can try to fight them in melee range, but I just don't see the point. Again, this is just my own experience, but I did look up a little bit, and it does seem like one of the things that people did struggle with in this game is the overall difficulty. And I think that the rivals are linked to that as well, because the game gets harder and harder the more you play, whether you like it or not. And this is a system that I don't fully understand, but it seems like apparently some enemies from later biomes start showing up in the earlier biomes if you just continue playing long enough, even if you've never beaten a run. It's not like, oh, you've beaten the run, so now things get harder. No, it's just a matter of if you just continue playing, you'll start encountering new enemies, even if you've never beaten it and you're struggling with the game, which is kind of odd. And the fact that, again, the rivals just kind of come in later and not from the start, the game doesn't really tell you that this is going to be a game where you need to go fast. I appreciate the fact that it's not from the start, so you can kind of get a handle of the game naturally and then have to go fast, but the fact that you're not aware that's going to be a thing is kind of interesting. So the rival mechanic is, I like the uniqueness, I like the idea. I think they're hit or miss. Sometimes when you're closely on the race with them, it can feel pretty intense, but you also don't really interact with them very much. And when you do interact with them, when you actually cross paths with them during the run, the fights I find are just not super fun. Now at the very end, you have like a little timer, and then like they can all get to you, and then you have to kill them all, and then you get your escape pod. But by then, it's just pretty easy to just kill them all. If you're just doing a gun build. So, yeah, it's just an interesting mechanic that I think was not executed perfectly, but definitely interesting, and I could imagine why people could be a little intimidated by it overall. Let's talk about the actual boons in this game. So during the run, you're going to be encountering different boons similar to Hades. And first off, I will say that there's a lot of different boons to pick from in terms of like the different classes of boons, right? You've got science, you've got electronic, you've got physics, you've got combustion, you've got gravity. There's a bunch of them, and that's cool. I like the fact that there's so many different ones to pick from. You might go for a run where your gun is going to be doing the combustion effect, or the freeze effect, or the gravity effect, or the critical damage effect. And that's going to be probably the most important boon that you'll be selecting. So I like the different boon classes, but I'm going to actually talk about my biggest issue with the game personally. I think the biggest issue this game has is a lack of synergies. And this is quite interesting, the reasoning behind it. As we discussed previously, you start off with a lot of different possible attacks, right? Or like just different mechanics inherently in your gameplay. You can dash, you can melee, you can charge melee, you can do a dash attack, you can shoot, you can kick, you can dash kick, and you can use your GRP ability. Now, one thing that this game decided to do was that every single one of these different boon classes, you know, like electronics, science, all that stuff, all of these have an upgraded version of every single one of these core gameplay mechanics. Basically, that means that in the gravity boons, you'll get a gravity boon that will, you know, naturally enhance your shooting, enhance your melee, enhance your dash attack, enhance your kick, enhance the GRP. And every single class of boons will have these boons as well. That means that in one run, you can have your GRP be a combustion one. You can have your melee attacks be a gravity one. You can have your shooting be electronic one. You can have your kick be a, I don't know, acid thing. And you can have your dash kick be something else. And you can have your dash attack be combustion again. The reason I'm bringing this up is that means that every time you see boons, odds are you're not going to find a unique ability that does something kind of interesting by itself. You're almost always going to just be seeing boons that just upgrades one of these starting abilities that you always have. And what this ends up creating is that for like most of the run, you're just going to be upgrading your core abilities. You're not going to be finding boons that by themselves do something. So if you don't like using your kick, then too bad. You're probably always going to be finding a boon that's going to enhance your kick, and you're eventually just going to pick it because you want to get rid of all the kick boon upgrades. And if you don't like your dash kick move, then you probably want to pick that boon eventually because it always shows up in whichever form of the class of boons that you're selecting. It's a bit hard to explain, but basically, instead of just having like your dash, your melee, and your shooting always have specific boon upgrades, it's everything else. So I would much rather not have all of these upgradable things specifically to my to the gameplay mechanics, and just have a bunch of unique boons that are interesting by themselves. So what that ends up creating is that you rarely get anything that synergizes with what you are actually trying to build. So for instance, I went for a frost gun build. And what that meant is that the first boon I found was an epic frost boon that increased my gun's attack damage by like 130%, but also had a chance to inflict freeze. And you're like, ooh, interesting. So you look at the freeze effect and it slows down the enemy. That's all good and all. But I wanted to get more cryo boons so I could try to find more synergies with my gun. And I found 0. Every time I would get a cryo boon, it would be a boon to increase my kick into like a freezing thing. Or whenever I take damage, I can do freeze in front of, like around me. Or whenever I do a dash attack, now it creates a little wave of ice in front of me. That's great, but I wanted a thing where every time an enemy reaches like full freeze, they explode. Or the freezing effects now also cause burning. Or, I don't know, just something interesting with the freeze. Or even things that could potentially synergize with other things. So, like, oh, my freeze now will explode if they're subject to fire damage. And then you could try to find that fire boon, and that would be cool. But that just wasn't the case. So I finished the entire run with just caring about that one boon on my gun and just the damage that it dealt, that I was just trying to improve my gun's damage without boons. And that was actually the first time I've ever beaten a run, and it felt pretty underwhelming because I had a very boring run. I was just focused on my gun that dealt a lot of damage, but didn't really synergize with anything. All my other boons just felt kind of useless. I wish there were a lot more boons that were about synergies and that did things by themselves instead of just having a ridiculous amount of boons that are about the core mechanics of sliding, dashing, all that good stuff. That's my biggest issue with the game. And all things considered, if that is my biggest issue, there are worse things in many games. Because effectively, this is a good game. This is a very solid game that I think is flawed in certain aspects, but it's still very enjoyable. Now, one thing that I've noticed that people struggled with in this game is something that's a bit unfortunate in my opinion, and that is the final boss. I'm not going to get into spoilers, but this game is also very grindy, and so you're not going to be winning your run on your first try. Not with this game. So you are going to need to do that grind. But eventually, once you get past the first few biomes and you're comfortable with all the biomes, you'll get to a point, at least in my experience, and I believe in a lot of people's experience, where you'll be very easily clearing out all the biomes and all the bosses except the last one. The last boss is, in my opinion, a little too hard. And when I say a little, I mean way too hard. And there just seems to be attacks that don't seem to fit with the way the game works by its inherently with the mechanics. Like, you can dash through attacks, but there are a few attacks against this boss where even if you just dash perfectly, I can't seem to be able to evade the attacks consistently. It just feels a little cheap, and the boss deals a lot of damage, and you die very quickly. So I will say, I think the final boss is a little overtuned in terms of difficulty, and it's kind of a shame because I got to a point where I would very easily get to the final boss without really taking much damage and almost always being at full health, reaching it, and then just getting absolutely annihilated by it. Especially since I was trying to do a little bit of melee stuff, and it's just generally not worth it. So once again, as I just mentioned, the game is very much a roguelite, and you're going to be grinding a lot of things in between runs. Grindy games, there's ups and downs to them. It depends on a lot of things. In this instance, I think there's some pretty cool things, but I also think things can get a little much at times. So, you can get unique suits to start off with. And these suits are similar to, how do you call them? The trinkets that you can start off with in Hades. It's not called a trinket, but you know what I mean. They have little effects, and you can always change them in between the biomes. That's cool. I wish they were more interesting. If you look at the ones in Hades, there's a lot of them that have very interesting mechanics. Also, they're the same thing as Hades, where some of them will have like increased chance to find a specific boon. But once again, since there's not many synergies in this game, I don't really personally see the point in it, unless you just want to just start off with the increased critical gun power-up, right? Ability, sure. But other than that, it's not as important as the one in Hades, in my opinion. There's a surprising amount of content in this game. Because every single one of the suits, which there are quite a few of, as you can just see, they also come with upgrades in all of these. And all these upgrades do completely different things. It's not just all these suits, it's 3 times all these suits, because all of these upgrades for each of these suits are pretty unique in that regard. And so actually, I want to retract what I said just a minute when I said that the suits are not very interesting. I actually think they probably are. It just takes a very long time to get to the interesting ones, because the default versions of these suits are not very interesting. But if you look at the different possible upgrades, you got some pretty interesting stuff in there. All rivals drop a biotech experiment when defeated. Cool. That means you can try to go for killing rivals. Or chill now requires 5 less stacks to freeze. That's awesome. That actually, means you can try to go for some cool chill stuff. Or, your shock chain to 1 additional target. Awesome. These are really cool effects. It's kind of interesting that you're not going to be seeing any of these effects for a very long time, because you're going to prioritize not going for those upgrades early on, because the grindiness in this game is pretty high. So I have never actually upgraded any of these suits yet to a different version of them, because I was just spending the time unlocking them. And it's cool to have so many options, and that you can change them in between the biomes. I really like that. So those are the suits, but once again, you also have different guns, and all these guns you can also upgrade. And once again, when you upgrade them, they do completely different things. One thing that I found pretty disappointing is that you actually can't upgrade them until you've beaten a run with them. So you're always going to be just stuck with whatever gun you have currently unlocked. You can't play with the cool versions of them until you've beaten the run, which again in this game is pretty hard in comparison to most other Hades likes. But the guns are pretty unique from one another. I haven't really played with the upgraded versions again because I have not gotten to beat many runs in this game. And the currency just takes a long time to unlock these things. So there's a lot of content and a lot of different variations of all these weapons and all these suits. It's just that, man, to get to that point, you need to play a lot. So I kind of wish that a lot of these things were available to players a little bit earlier because, man, like that grindiness is just a lot. Another big, very important aspect. This is where your power level is drastically increased depending on whether you just start playing or you're a few hours in. So these are equipped skills that you'll have permanently. And these range from, hazards deal more damage to enemies. Cool. You can buy that and you can equip it. And it's not like you choose 3 of them. No. You can equip 10? I think it's 10. Right now I'm at 9, but I can unlock one more slot. So you can have 10 of these things. And some of these are really, really powerful. I mean, we're talking getting resurrected when you die. Your damage is increased for the first 10 seconds of each room by 30%, and you can level those up. Extremely importantly, getting health back at the end of each encounter for health. Not getting this early makes you way weaker than someone who's played it for now 10 hours. And I'm not even close to getting like a really good build. Most of these skills that I've got equipped aren't even leveled up much because they cost so much, and I can still put in 2 more of these skills in there, and you can also unlock more pages of possible upgrades that I haven't seen yet. It's crazy. These are so important to get stronger. So once again, really showing how important these outside of run currencies are. And there's a 4th one as well. There's a lot of different currencies that you'll be using a lot. The 4th one is this one's complicated. I'm not going to get into details, but it allows you to give traps to rivals while they're progressing. Once again, it's an interesting mechanic that I don't think is super necessary, I would say. And then you can also, unlock some specific things throughout your run. Like, fabricators are now always available in between biomes. Cool. Restore some health in between biomes. Awesome. The gear locker is available between lockers, between biomes. That's great. There's only 5 of them, though, which is confusing to me because I feel like you could have a lot more. Just having 5, I unlocked all these options very quickly in comparison to the amount of stuff that I still need to unlock with the gear and like the guns and everything. So that was a little surprising. So the game is super grindy. Whether you like that or not, that's up to you. I think it's cool to have things to unlock. I just think it's a little overtuned in terms of how slow it takes to unlock all this stuff. And I think one of the reasons for it during runs in Hades, if you are looking for a particular currency, all right, that you want to grab in order to upgrade something in the hub, you can go for it, right? Like, eventually you're going to find a door that either gives you, like, purple gems or, like, normal gems, and you can choose which one you want for your... You're like, oh, well, I want to upgrade this thing in my hub, so I'm going to go for these, for this currency. And then you go get that, and then you continue on. In this game, it's not going to be like one room reward is going to be an option to give you currencies for the hub, and then like the next room reward is going to be an upgrade for the current run, right? No, you can have some rooms that will give you currencies for the hub, which again is completely useless for the run, or a boon, which I just find that so interesting, because why would you want to go for something that is going to be detrimental to your run instead of going for a boon, which is way more fun? Yeah, you could say, oh, I really want to unlock this suit, so I'm going to go for that currency. But the fact that choosing that option is going to make the run harder, for me, just is kind of a weird design choice. Because the right way of doing it, in my opinion, is... Well, actually, Hades also kind of struggles with it, because it's never fun to have your room rewards just be currencies for the hub that serve no purpose in the run, because then it feels like you're just wasting your time. So I don't think Hades does it well, but at least it doesn't feel cheap. Here, I just feel like I'm never going to pick a currency unless I've already beaten the game many times and I don't care about winning the run or I'm really powerful. So I kind of wish that, there were other ways of getting these currencies other than losing a boon for it, if that makes sense. So that means that you're not going to be getting these currencies often unless you really never care about your runs and you always go for these currencies, which is going to make you very weak in the long run for the run and very likely not allow you to beat the final boss if you even get there. So I want to premise that, again, I think it's always easier to talk about the negatives in a game, and I think the game is very enjoyable. But I do want to bring up a few other like random notes that I find interesting that I haven't heard people mentioning. For instance, right before going to a boss, you have a shop, which is a fabricator, and that fabricator is not guaranteed to give you health, which is interesting. You don't always have a guarantee of gaining some health back before a boss, which is not something you see very often, and I kind of wish there was that option. I actually think that the fabricators are pretty boring. They always just have 3 options, a gun modifier or a and a melee modifier followed by a little thing or currencies. It's just the fabricators are just too small. They don't have enough things in it, in my opinion. I think they should have a lot more stuff to buy in the fabricators and have more interesting things like in Hades. The healing in between biomes that you eventually upgrade, like I showed before, that healing is a set amount and not percentage based, which is interesting. I kind of wish it was percent based, just because that way it would actually encourage players to gain more health. Getting max health, it almost feels like a build. If you want to go for a bunch of max health, that's great. But since it's a set amount between biomes, it kind of punishes you if you go for a lot of health. It doesn't feel like it synergizes with what you were going for. If it's a percent base, I feel like it's more rewarding in that regard. And lastly, I think the GRP, which is this little blasting effect here, it's cool, and this might just be me, honestly, but I rarely actually get to really feel like it's super useful, especially in bosses, unless you get a particular upgrade for it that is good against bosses, which is rare because they usually don't do much. I personally think it would be fun if they would deal damage, so it would kind of reinforce you to actually use it more often, because right now I like the idea that you can push things into other things that would explode. Inherently, I think the mechanic is really cool. But I'm just kind of disappointed that it doesn't deal even just a little bit of damage initially. And again, it's just another thing on top of your shooting and everything that generally is just not going to be super useful in boss battles. And boss battles are probably the trickiest thing in this game. They did a really good job with the level design. It's filled with traps, hazards that hurt you, but also hurt enemies. And the GRP really does help try to strategically move things onto enemies to deal damage to them. And in general, it's really fun to be able to explode barrels from a distance. The game gives you an option to, if you see a barrel from a distance, you can just press a button and it will just explode. It doesn't matter how you do it. Don't ask questions. And I think that's cool. You rarely see a lot of focus on hazards in games, and I think this game did a really good job with it, and is very enjoyable and really helps with being able to clear rooms quite efficiently. Alright, so my final take on this game, I think Redacted is good. I think it's a solid Hades-like that has a ton of content. A ton of content that might take a while to get to, unfortunately. But it's still very enjoyable, and I still am always kind of like curious about what else is the game offering. Now that I've beaten it, and I'm excited to like unlock a bunch of stuff. Hard mode, zombie mode, whatever that is, new suits, new stuff. So I'm definitely excited to see what else this game has. I kind of wish there were a few more, secrets, maybe more, like Hades had a few secrets, and especially in the lore. But overall, I'd say this game is fun. It's enjoyable. The core gameplay is just satisfying. I think it could be even more fun if things flowed better between the melee and the ranged. And I wish that there were more synergies in the boons and the builds, because right now it just feels like whatever modifier you find to your melee or range attack is all that really matters. But other than that, I mean, this might sound like a lot of negative things, but overall the game just inherently is fun, and there's a lot of content and there's a lot of work put into it. So if you're looking for another Hades, especially in the gameplay aspect, then I'd say that Redacted is a good time, especially if you want a challenge, because let me tell you, good luck with that final boss. Boy, oh boy, did it take me a hard second. It was fun for me to have a challenge, because I tend to be very comfortable with this genre, and this was probably the hardest final boss I've ever had to deal with in a Hades-like. So if you're looking for a challenge, Redacted might just be for you. But yeah, that's about it.